So, ladies and gentlemen, it's Sadaf Faruqi here from Cambridge. It's my pleasure to introduce the final part of today's program, and we're going to hear a debate. So just while people are sort of stretching their legs, just to remind you a little bit about the format of today's session. So the topic of the debate is on obesity, but before we actually start the actual topic, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how we're going to organize things. In a second, you're going to see the instructions for how we're going to take a vote before we start the debate. Then we're going to hear from both speakers for and against the motion. There'll be time for some questions, and then we're going to vote again at the end to see whether they've managed to change your opinions. Okay, so here I think hopefully you're now seeing the instructions for how you're going to vote. So using your phone or your iPad or other mobile device, you can open your browser and put in www.slido.com, and hopefully when you do that, you'll be able to put in the specific code for this event, which is #N348, and then if you do that, you should see the screen on the right, which allows you to vote. So we're voting on the question that this House believes that the UK population trend in obesity cannot be reversed without food taxation. So hopefully, if you've managed to log on and you've got this, can I ask you to vote now, whether you are for or against or undecided? Okay, I'm tempted to count down, but I think you know. Okay, 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, last chance to vote. Okay, we close the vote. Thank you. Okay, so we see, I think, that very clearly, overwhelmingly, this House supports the motion. So generally, people think that we need to have food taxation if we're going to address the challenges associated with obesity. Okay, so really with that background, it's now my pleasure to invite the two speakers. And first, I'm going to invite Professor Roy Taylor from Newcastle, who's going to speak for the motion. Roy. Just over 5 minutes, I've got a little timer which will go off. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Faruqi. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Now, death and taxation may be inevitable, but they're also quite unwelcome. Perhaps taxation would be a little less unwelcome if the reasons for it were clearly understood. So let's just consider the obesity thing. Why is it so important? Well, if we compare our population now, or at least 2012, for which we've got best data, with how the population was in 1980, we find there's been a profound change. In this time, the average man and the average woman has increased in weight by 1.5 stone. That's an astonishing move of the average of a population. 1980, 7% obese. 2012, 25% obese. And the worst thing is, it predominantly affects the young people who will be most profoundly affected. In fiscal terms, the government tells us it costs the UK £35 billion a year, but in fact that undersells it because there's a human cost here of the health issues. So it's really important. But what are the barriers to actually getting things done? Well, the first barrier really is a lack of political will, which is a funny thing. Now, when David Cameron was about to be presented with a paper on composition of food, he announced in advance he would not be legislating. If we look at the election before, the shadow Minister of Health, the Labour Minister of Health, announced that if elected, they would not be legislating on food. That's very odd. What's going on? Well, we have the influence, the undue influence of the food companies, suppliers, retailers, who have enormous influence. They donate hugely to the coffers of all political parties, not partisan, this is all round, and guarantee quite an ear. So there is huge influence, some of it really very intelligent and subtle that you wouldn't expect. So for instance, Coca-Cola conducted a major campaign against the salt reduction process and actually succeeded in getting the committee fired and Lansley put in place his placement. So Coca-Cola wanted to keep the population a bit thirsty to sell its product. So don't underestimate this particular factor. then politicians may very reasonably say, well, the experts don't agree. Now, that certainly has been the case in the past, but we're moving towards consensus. The recent guidelines from Diabetes UK, from the ADA, all point out that the old ideas about must be low fat, must be this, are just artificial. And there is a consensus emerging, but that has been a historical problem. And then there's the favourite tactic of politicians to deny that regulation would be effective. Just think back to the hoo-ha over introducing speed limits, motorcycle helmets, seat belts, smoking. All of those are things of the past, and the death rates have tumbled once they were introduced, and the vested interests that were bending the ear of the politicians have been overcome. Well, that's the background, but let's just take a fresh look at the problem. Taxation. What can we tax? Well, I would suggest that there are 3 easily identifiable targets. There are more, but let's just focus on these. There's a matter of added sugar in ready meals. This is quite obscene. If you look at the concentration of sugar in what you might buy, even from responsible retailers, Marks and Spencer's for goodness sake, you find it can be as high as 50 grams per portion. There's one Sainsbury's product that goes up to 60 grams per portion. That's a huge amount of sugar that will not trigger any satiety response, but will be calories in the body. So that's important. Sugar tax we have already, but don't count your chickens before they're hatched, because the food industry is busily trying to undermine it. Excess portion tax. Now, we might think about supersized meals from McDonald's, but there's more to it than that. Let me take you to our local coffee shop. How about a nibble with your cup of coffee? Perhaps a little muffin? Well, if you went for the chocolate choice, you would see that this choice will incur almost 500 calories load. That's about a quarter of the day's calorie requirements for a woman. How about this nice, healthy, skinny blueberry? That must be healthy. In fact, 312, that's about 1/6 of the calorie intake for one day. This is huge, and it's not necessarily so. The excess could certainly be taxed, perhaps setting some arbitrary limit. It was recently suggested that 250 calories should be the upper limit of snacks served on NHS premises. A limit could be decided. But then there's a matter of the sugar tax itself, which is just on sweetened beverages. Now, in this slide, we've got data showing the effect on different age groups, and I'd like you to look particularly at the soft drinks, bearing in mind what I said about obesity having the most deleterious effects upon the youth. And you can see that the intake of sugar-sweetened beverages is far greater in this group. And when a calculation was done for the effect upon UK obesity of cutting back on the sugar in beverages, there is 5 times the effect in young people compared with the rest. And people say, well, tax isn't effective. Price is the #1 thing. Just look at this. Does education about health matter? Well, price comes way at the top. That is really very potent. And so we can focus on what's effective. Hidden sugar, excess portion size, sugar in drinks. But this doesn't come in isolation. Tax alone won't be sufficient, even though it will be the major player. We also have other factors, each of which has to play a part. But make no mistake, we're fighting a mighty battle against a major adverse effect on the health of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now if I can invite the second speaker, Dr. Tahrani from Birmingham, to now speak against the motion.
Right, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this exciting debate. So Professor Taylor has actually made my job very easy. His last slide is exactly what I will come to at the end of my talk as well. Food taxes alone are not enough. They need a lot of other interventions with them. And the whole motion was about food taxes reversing the obesity epidemic. Food taxes alone won't do it. Food taxes with other interventions can do it. And then I will move now to my talk. So my position is against, because I do believe that obesity trends in the UK can be reversed without food taxation. However, food taxes can be useful and can be a useful tool, but it's one tool out of many. And on their own, they cannot do it. And I'm going now to highlight the reasons why I believe that food taxation on its own is not enough. Food tax is an oversimplistic approach to a very complex problem. And obesity is not just simply due to weak resolve. The demand for any product is a function of its price, the price of other products, the income, and other factors such as advertising. By adjusting the food tax, you are adjusting one of these 4 components and is unlikely to cause a huge effect. Obesity is a very complex problem. Yes, we do have a homeostatic mechanism which controls energy expenditure and energy intake. But this is embedded in a very complex map of factors, this is from the Foresight project, this slide, which shows that these mechanisms are influenced by a huge number of factors. And food tax will address one little box in this big map which you see. The other problem we have is we don't actually have a problem making people lose weight. We have a problem maintaining that weight loss. And maintaining weight loss is a biological issue. There are biological causes and reasons why people can't maintain the weight loss, and these are not addressed by the food tax. When people lose a significant amount of weight, they develop metabolic adaptation, which means they have more hunger hormones, less satiety hormones, and that drives them to eat more and eat more of the calorie-dense food, so they have excess energy intake. And at the same time, there is metabolic adaptation with drop in energy expenditure, which drop their energy expenditure down, so they regain weight. Food tax can't solve this issue. Food taxes can be challenging, and Professor Taylor showed you examples of what can be taxed, but there's always the question about how much of it, and how much tax, and for how long. And who is going to play the cat and mouse game with the industry, which will change the composition of their food all the time, and then legislation need to be changed. And in real life, Denmark introduced the first tax in October 2011. By November 2012, they stopped it, because the shoppers went to neighboring Germany and bought all the stuff they want. And food taxes raise ethical issues. Food is not like smoking and alcohol. It's a necessity. Now, I appreciate most of the audience will think alcohol is also a necessity, but for the purpose of this talk, it isn't. It's only food a necessity. And people from lower income will be disadvantaged, and they will pay, in relative terms, higher proportion of their income on the tax. Now, this can be offset if you use subsidies and make healthier food cheaper. But then we are talking here about food taxes with subsidies, not just food taxes. That's a different intervention. There is the substitution effect, which means if I put tax on sugary drink, I don't know what will happen to the consumption of carbohydrate and fat from other sources. Most of the modeling studies that support the use of food taxation did not take the substitution effect into account. And this is related to something called cross-price elasticity, which is no time to discuss at the moment. The next point is how much tax will actually be passed to the consumer. All the modeling studies assume that whatever tax we put on the manufacturer, 100% of it will be passed to the consumer. That's not true. Big companies in the UK who have domination in the market, they are very dominant, they will just simply play with other prices of other products to absorb the shock of the tax and pass as little as possible to the consumer so they can sell their products. And then what people usually forget is that actually people with obesity already pay more. And it's clearly not working because we still have a lot of obese patients in the UK. They pay more on their health insurances, life insurances, income protection, travel costs, clothes. They suffer from discrimination and stigma at workplace with lower pay and less promotions. Still not working. But just remember, the VAT system is also make you pay more for unhealthy food. The 0% VAT apply for the healthier options. The 20% VAT applies for the unhealthy options. Still not working. So if we look at examples from other countries, I just showed you Denmark failed. Samoa, which has got 95% prevalence of obesity and overweight, they've put fat taxes, they've put flight taxes, they still have 95% of their population overweight and obese. Finland, Hungary, France, Mexico had better luck in terms of showing that taxes actually can produce reduction in intake. But these reductions were modest, and there's still no evidence that actually they can reduce obesity. So can we do it without taxes? Yes, we can. But I agree with Professor Taylor. The political will is needed. You cannot expect the food industry to voluntarily change. We need healthy food in school. We need to get rid of the vending machines. We need to change the transport and built environment. We need to provide access to treatment and of obesity and preventative measures. And we need to stop showing these advertisements where we can convince people, encourage people for emotional eating, like the lady who's hugging a lot of donuts, and stop telling people that you can eat these burgers and have Pepsis that still look like these women in the picture, and stop relating a burger from McDonald's to performance in the Olympics. Oops, sorry. So to summarize, and I didn't show you the evidence for that because there is no time. Food tax needs to be more than 20%, and particularly on sugary sweet beverages, when combined with other measures, might reduce consumption, and we don't know if it actually will finish obesity or get rid of obesity. There is no strong evidence for the implementing of food tax as the sole intervention to curb obesity, and there is no evidence that controlling obesity trends is not possible without food taxation. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to both speakers for staying to time. So I think we're going to have a little chance now for both speakers perhaps to ask each other a question or two, and then we're going to invite some questions from the audience. So Professor Taylor, I think we should give you the chance to maybe address some of the comments raised by Dr. Tahrani.
Thank you. The experience of other countries is really rooted in some history. For instance, trying to legislate on fat in food relates to the dismal concentration on fat as part of the diet, which relates to epidemiological data now discredited. So, in fact, it was realized fairly rapidly that this wasn't effective, but also it was helped by huge influence of the food companies who were trying to dislodge it, and they were successful. So it's not surprising that taxes can come and go in a democracy. Democracies are not great for actually taking definitive action and sustaining it. So that really is quite important. But I'm glad to hear you agree with me on the need for a multiple approach. But here we have an effective tool, a fiscal tool, without which we cannot hope to reverse obesity. So we're dealing with something that is really extremely powerful in that whole panoply. So the difficulties, I hope I convinced you that it was possible to take a complex problem and break it down into simple parts. So can you tell me why these simple parts wouldn't make a difference?
So what I said is that one single part of it will not make a big difference. And certainly there is currently data and recent systematic review meta-analysis also showing that the health effects are actually probably modest for the reductions, because don't forget, it's a complex issue. So if I tell you, for example, that when you introduce the sugar tax, there will be a 20% drop in sugar tax intake, and that would be probably a very optimistic level. But let's assume it's 20%. This is not 20% in every patient or every individual. This is probably 80% in some people and 0% in some people, and some people will just go and drink more for whatever reason it is. So the difficulty here is that just applying one single intervention will certainly not actually solve the problem. And we can solve the problem by many other interventions. However, I do agree with Prof. Taylor that this intervention, combined with others, can be useful. But as he highlighted, the complexity of the issue is here that whatever we apply in terms of taxes, it needs to be very clear, very specific, with a clear aim and a clear monitoring strategy, because circumstances will change, the manufacturers will try to get around it, and industry very clever and very, very powerful.
Perhaps I could follow up on just one specific issue, and that is your comment about people of lower incomes being unfairly affected. Now, this has to be seen in the context. Where is obesity the greatest problem? It's in those very groups. So at the moment, there's a problem of excess provision of cheap calories. Now, that should be able to be addressed by the moves I suggested. So the oft-wheeled out argument that it would be unfair to do this is in fact targeting it specifically. And we have really very good evidence that this indeed does work. So specific groups will be targeted. Perhaps I could just remind you of the effect on the young, the 18 to 30-year-olds, who have this 5 times greater effect of merely this single issue of the sugar-sweetened beverage. So perhaps could I invite you to recant?
Yeah. So I agree, but why do I need even to implement sugar beverages drinks on drinks that are consumed largely by kids? I just don't make it available to them. They are not going to die if they don't have Pepsi or Diet Coke, or Coke. So they just simply shouldn't have vending machines in the first place that sell them. The canteen should never give them. So this is not just a food taxation issue. I agree, these drinks are poisonous for the kids, but they shouldn't be there in the first place. They are not actually essential tool of life. The other comment, which I just want to address the point about the people from lower income. Professor Taylor is correct. Some of the data suggests that actually the impact of the tax is particularly can be useful for people at lower income. The difficulty here is this. If you are poor and you have children and the unhealthy food is far more expensive than the healthy food, just giving you extra tax on it, unless it becomes more expensive than the healthy food, you will still buy the unhealthy food. So it will only work if that extra money used to subsidize the healthy food, so the healthy food is cheaper and is a viable option for a poor person with a family. But again, I go back that the motion wasn't about food taxes with subsidies. It was about food taxes on their own.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to now open up to the audience. So we've got time for a few questions. Okay. Come on, I need some brave people to come to the microphone. Okay. Brave candidate number one.
I'm Shoaib from Oxford. So first question is, the problem of obesity and its risk on health, how much is it different from the effect of smoking on health? And secondly, you mentioned the vested interest of the food companies in this problem. How is it different from the vested interest of cigarette companies a couple of decades ago in smoking? And the way we tackled smoking, for example, in the last 10, 20 years, can we use the same strategies to deal with this problem?
Thank you. I think the similarities between smoking and the food excess business is that they're both terribly deleterious to health. But there the similarities stop, because smoking is a one-off single issue that can be isolated. But if we look back to just the post-war years, when taxation was sharply increased, and look at the rates of smoking, it used to be very prevalent in the population. Both my parents used to smoke. Both gave up in 1946 when the taxes were introduced. There is a huge effect that can be produced. Now, smoking was seen off to a greater extent by the legislation at public spaces. That's perfectly true. But we can see very precisely what can be achieved by adjusting the promoters and otherwise. So similarities, yes. We have to have food, as my honourable opponent observes, but it really has to be seen in the light that we can adjust it, and we can adjust it in such a way that it is relatively targeted against those of greatest need to produce a healthier next generation.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up with that, Professor Taylor, if you would come back. So differences between smoking and food. Okay, so as you say, they are different. Okay. But one you have to eat versus you don't necessarily have to smoke. But there's also another difference, and that may be relevant in terms of thinking about whether taxation may or may not work. And that is that how far do we know whether it's the cost of the food that primarily drives what people eat? Because you may change the cost, which may then, if that was the major factor driving what people eat and how much they eat, that might work. But actually, if the nutrients in the food, the palatability of the food, the appearance of the food are the factors that drive what people eat, then actually the taxation may not work.
The slide I showed from the DEFRA survey really makes very nicely the point that the factor of price was twice as great as any other factor on that rather long list. So yes, of course, we're dealing with some human behavior which could be said to be complex, but often saying something that's complex is an excuse for not dissecting out its component parts in a nice scientific way, such as we do. So I would suggest that we can see a way forward here.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, can I just say, if there's a 20% reduction in intake, that's a massive effect on profits of that company. And so it will affect them, and it's got to be driven by industry. They've got to look at what they're putting in. Look at Lucozade, they've already reduced their sugar content. So if we have the tax, and it does affect their profits, then they're going to have to make changes, which will affect all of us.
So you are absolutely right, but the question here is, having 20% tax might affect that product if actually the tax is passed to the consumer. Depending on the size of the company and the product you are talking about, they can re-optimize other products' prices. And hence, they will absorb some of that tax in order not to have this big drop in it. And we cannot assume that definitely the tax is going to go to the consumer. This depends on the company and how their strategy actually to overcome this issue. The other issue, which is also important, you might reduce the 20% in sugar drink, and that might reduce their sugar. They might decide to reduce the sugar in their product. It will depend on what level the government is going to say, at which below you are not going to have the tax anymore. So there is also a cost to reducing the sugar, and the company might look, depending on where the level is going to be drawn, and I know the UK government has got already the level, but I'm talking in general terms. If that level can be reduced without much extra cost, the company will be more willing to it. But if actually to reduce it, it will cost a lot of money and might lose a lot of customers because of palatability, the company will not do it. What I'm trying to say here is not that food taxes are rubbish. What I'm trying to say is that it's actually a very complex environment to just simply predict what's going to happen without really very good evidence behind it to say that this is, as a single intervention, will just sort out obesity. That doesn't exist.
So that's an interesting point. Okay, so the evidence is actually very limited. Now, if we think about other interventions we try to introduce, usually we do so on the basis of some evidence rather than just assuming it sounds like a good idea. So do you know what is the longest duration of evidence in terms of these 13 countries, I think, that have introduced a food tax?
Yeah.
What is the best data that we have, other than Denmark, of course, changing their mind after 12 months?
Yeah. So I was actually did another search of the literature yesterday night just to be completely up to date where we are. So 3 things to remember. 1, the vast majority of the literature is modeling. It's not actually based on real data. That's the vast literature. Real data from Mexico, which is currently actually seems to produce the longest term data, is about 3 years. And that has not yet showed any impact on obesity per se, but there was some impact on intake. There is 1 randomized controlled trial of very short duration in the literature, and the rest, as I mentioned, are just modeling based on assumptions, and these assumptions can be criticized. I mean, a simple example will be that all the modeling studies assume that all ethnicities will respond the same to the tax, for example, which clearly we just simply don't know.
Okay, great, terrific.
Just a very quick comment. The Mexico data is interesting because, as my honourable opponent observes, it's the longest duration. Now, we see a 12% drop in sugar-sweetened beverages and an increase in non-sweetened beverages, almost always water. That is concentrated almost entirely in the target population that we're looking at to maximize health. So I would suggest that the Mexico data is compelling. I think it's very fair to say that we lack conclusive data. But if we wait around for conclusive data, I think the epidemic will overtake us.
Final comment, yeah.
So I agree with what Prof. Taylor said. Water intake has actually increased, and he's absolutely right that this particularly happened in people of poorer background because water became the cheaper thing to pay for them. But that may not necessarily reflect what will happen in the UK. People here, despite that we have poor people, are much richer. A can of Coke, if it goes from 60 pence to 70 pence, may not bring, or 75 pence, may not actually break the bank. He is right, Professor Taylor is right that we can't wait forever. But actually, this debate of food tax has been going on for more than a decade. And we had no reason why in that decade we couldn't get the evidence. The problem is we never actually attempted to get the evidence. And it was the politics versus the key opinion leaders versus the food industry with no real evidence. That's what we've got modeling studies, which are the most what is available there in the literature. We can generate evidence if there is a will to generate evidence, but I don't think necessarily there is a big will.
Terrific. Okay, so if there are no further questions from the floor, I'm going to close the debate from the 2 speakers and thank them very much. And now I think it's over to you, the audience. Hopefully, again, you can go back onto your www.slido.com. You can put back in your code of #348, and hopefully you can once again vote. Did the speakers change your mind, or did it just confirm what you previously thought? You've listened to the evidence. What do you think? Can you vote now? Okay. We've got a few more seconds to vote. Everybody voted now? Everybody found it? Okay. In which case, 5 more seconds. And now we're going to close the vote now. Thank you. And so, no one else? No. Professor O'Reilly, please stop trying to vote again. Okay. Okay, we've closed the vote. And so we got the conclusion just over here, coming up live on our screen. I feel like the Eurovision Song Contest. This is great. Okay. So we got the conclusion. Somebody's just figuring it out. I think we could probably see what the conclusion was. I think perhaps a bit more even than it was at the beginning. Have I got the vote, Claire and Claire? It's coming. Oh, okay. The computer, I could actually figure it out quicker than the computer. Okay, here it is. Okay, so we started with 63% of the audience for the motion. And we finished with 41% for the motion and 58% against the motion. So I think the majority of the audience now is against the motion, and therefore I think, Dr. Tahrani, you've managed to convince us. Thank you very much. Thank you, folks.